As a huge roguelite fan, I've been wondering for a while what percentage of players actually quote-unquote beat roguelikes and roguelites. So I decided to compile some Steam achievement data to try to answer that question. In order to determine how many players actually beat roguelites and roguelikes, we first have to decide what that actually means. If you're familiar with the genre, you'll know that roguelikes don't have endings in the same way that regular games do, and you'll know that these games are designed with theoretically infinite replayability in mind, which means you're not supposed to just beat the game and move on. You're supposed to keep playing again and again. Because of that, I'm going to be using the word beat here in a very loose sense that, again, doesn't match up with more traditional games. I think there are 2 or 3 different ways in which you can quote-unquote beat a roguelike. The first one is just clearing a run on any difficulty. Since roguelikes are run-based in some form, clearing one of those runs at all can be considered the bare minimum for beating a roguelike. If you haven't cleared a run at all, you certainly have not beaten a roguelike, even in that loosest sense of the word beat. Second, because so many roguelites have difficulty modes, I think clearing a run on the hardest difficulty setting could be a second metric you could use to determine whether or not someone actually beat the game. If you've beaten a roguelike or roguelite on the hardest difficulty, you obviously have a high degree of skill and proficiency at the game, and you've seen a lot of the core content the game has to offer, even if there still are some items, builds, or synergies that you haven't played around with yet. Again, roguelikes theoretically have infinite replayability. There's theoretically no max to how much you can play it. But if you've beaten a game on the hardest difficulty, you've certainly seen a critical mass of what the game has to offer. There are, of course, other challenges you can impose on yourself, like speedrunning or getting certain scores in games that have scoreboards, but I wouldn't personally consider those things to be core to beating a roguelite. Finally, some roguelites have an alternative or hidden boss. So when applicable, we'll look at how many people completed those as well. Also, if you have a different idea about what it means to quote-unquote beat a roguelike or roguelite, I would be curious to hear what you have to say as well. I'm going to do a quick spoiler-free overview of the data that's just the games and the numbers, and then I'll follow that up with a more in-depth discussion that includes spoilers for things like final boss names, secret bosses, true endings, etc. So with that in mind, let's talk briefly about what data we're looking at and how I collected it. If you don't care about the nitty-gritty of these details, feel free to skip ahead to the timestamps in the description. I collected the data from 19 roguelikes and roguelites. I tried to pick a mix of games across subgenres, and I picked mostly popular games with a few more niche games mixed in. To collect the data, I used Steam achievements in order to find an achievement that either exactly matched or most closely matched those 3 milestones that I outlined earlier: clearing a run at all, clearing a run on the hardest difficulty, and beating the alternative boss or ending when applicable. I think it's worth noting that there is some debate over what the percentage actually means for Steam achievements, because it's unclear what the denominator is. In other words, if the achievement has a 50% completion rate, it's unclear who that 50% is of. 50% of who completed that achievement. Some people think it's the number of people who installed the game. Some people think it's the number of people who have started up the game, actually booted it up. But Valve themselves have never clarified that number, so just keep that in mind. There is some wiggle room with this data. I generally wanted to avoid DLC-related achievements as well, because not all players will have the DLC. So any achievement that requires the DLC will be artificially low as a result. For example, a 10% achievement completion rate could actually be 100% of possible players if only 10% of the player base bought the DLC. There might be a similar problem here with early access games, or games that were in some point in early access, because some players might not have been able to complete achievements for beating the final boss if the final boss wasn't added to the game yet. Most games I picked for this video were not in early access, but there are a couple that were. Additionally, I didn't really include many traditional roguelikes because I'm less familiar with them, and they also had achievement overload with games like Tome having nearly 2,000 achievements, so I wasn't entirely sure which to pick, which were the important ones. There are also some times where I had to make judgment calls over which Steam achievement to use, but we'll talk about that a little later on. First, let's do a quick spoiler-free overview of the data. Here are the results for the percentage of players that got any win or any successful run. As you can see, there's a pretty wide range, with Monster Train having the highest overall win rate of nearly 90%, and Darkest Dungeon having the lowest of not even 6%. The average for all these games was about 42%, which makes sense to me, and I was expecting about 50% before I started. And now, here's the achievement data for players to beat the hardest difficulty setting at some point. This takes a lot more time, is by definition harder to do. So it's not surprising to see a lot lower numbers that average out to about 6.5%. These completion rates range from 22% for Gunfire Reborn and less than 1% for games like Undermine and Vaults of the Void. But we'll come back to those numbers in a second. I'm going to show a description for all these achievements now, as well as the hidden bosses and endings. So if you want to avoid those spoilers, please stop watching this video. So with the achievement descriptions on screen, I think there are a couple main trends that I found. First, and unsurprisingly, Darkest Dungeon and Children of Morta have a lot lower completion rates than the average, which is likely due to the mission style structure of these games, which deviates from a lot of other roguelikes and roguelites. You typically go on specific missions instead of more general runs. These games also require a higher minimum time commitment because you have to clear a certain number of runs in order to win the game, whereas in a normal roguelite, you could theoretically beat the game on your first run. And they also have a lot more vertical progression and grinding. If we take these games out of the average, we end up with 45.7% instead of 42% for completing a basic run. Removing Darkest Dungeon from the hardest win column as well doesn't really affect the number much. I also had to make a lot of judgment calls for the hardest win category because there wasn't always an achievement that exactly matched up with the hardest difficulty in the game. For example, the hardest Gunfire Reborn achievement is for beating Nightmare, which is the hardest standard difficulty mode. But the game also has a fourth hard difficulty mode with additional game mechanics called Reincarnation mode, and that doesn't have a nice corresponding achievement. So that 22% there doesn't actually match up with the hardest difficulty mode in the game. Similarly, the Haze achievement is the hardest difficulty they have listed as a Steam achievement, but it's only about 16 heat in-game, so a lot of players have gone a lot higher. Also, some games have infinite scaling difficulty modes, like Undermine for example, or infinite run structures, like looping the game in Nuclear Throne. So for those games, I kind of just picked what seemed like the most reasonable hardest difficulty achievement that avoided things like speedruns or niche conditions, like beating the game with a certain class or something like that. This meant that Undermine's achievement percentage is artificially low in my opinion, because beating 30 difficulty levels felt like an artificial, arbitrary line to draw, and there's no real incentive in the game to do that. And this means that Nuclear Throne's hardest win percentage is maybe artificially high, because it's basically just an achievement for looping the game, as opposed to a harder game mode or getting far while looping. I also didn't include the hardest win number for Isaac because I wasn't sure what to do about the DLC being required to unlock more bosses and stuff like that. As I mentioned earlier, I don't want to include DLC achievements because they would be artificially low due to not all players owning that DLC. So now let's reorder this chart and look at it in numerical order. One of the first things I noticed is that card game or deck builder roguelites were at the top of the list with the highest rates. So I decided to average them out individually, and card game roguelites, or at least the four I have in this video, average out to 72.5% completion rate for any run, or the easiest run possible. I'm not sure why card game roguelites have a much higher win rate. Maybe they're more accessible, maybe there's more transferable skills between card game roguelites, but the average win rate for card game roguelites is a lot higher than the genre as a whole. I was surprised to see Curse of the Dead Gods have such a low number. I think that maybe it's just a weird data point. I guess it makes sense when you consider the game wasn't early access for a while without this boss, so without this achievement, and the game itself is fairly hard. The game also does have shorter runs you complete before you actually get on to what I personally consider to be the real runs, which include beating this final boss, but you could certainly argue that those early, shorter runs should count instead. I was also surprised to see so many people had beat Risk of Rain 2 on Monsoon difficulty. I wonder how much of that is because co-op exists versus people actually beating it solo. I personally found a number of these other achievements, like Into the Breach on hard mode or the Haze achievement, for example, to be easier than Monsoon in Risk of Rain 2. But I also know that I'm remarkably average at Risk of Rain 2, so maybe this is more about my skill level than about players in general. I think the difference between the percentage of players that got the easiest win and the hardest win for each game is also pretty interesting. You could argue that some games are strictly easier than others based on the numbers. So for example, you could argue Monster Train is easier than Slay the Spire because it has a higher percentage of players getting both the easy win and the hardest win. But if you compare Neon Abyss to Spelunky, for example, Neon Abyss has a much higher easy win rate, but a lot lower hardest win rate. Realistically, I think this has more to do with players giving up on Neon Abyss, as well as how the difficulty modes are structured in that game. These percentages are maybe not a good proxy for determining how hard or how easy a game is, because a low percentage could mean it was hard to do, is a hard achievement, or it can mean that players were bored of the game and didn't want to keep playing more. But I do think there are games that have easier easy modes and harder hard modes in comparison to other games. And if that's true, there needs to be more nuance to talking about which game is easier or which game is harder, if the easy mode is easier and the hard mode is harder, it's hard to capture that with a simple one adjective label. Finally, let's wrap up by looking at the hidden bosses or alternative endings. There were only 4 games on this list, so there isn't really much to conclude about this, but in general, a smaller number of players completed this than completed the easy win, but still more players did these alternative bosses or endings than completed the hardest difficulty, the hardest run possible. Both these conclusions make sense, they're kind of intuitive to me, and it also made sense that Gunfire Reborn had the highest percentage here, because I know a lot of players consider the Pole Monarch, this technically alternative optional boss, as the actual true normal final boss. That is to say, a lot of players don't treat this boss as optional, as alternative. So I hope this data was interesting to other people as well. I thought I would throw it together because it's a question I've had for a while, and I wanted to know what the answer was. I'm curious if anything from this data stands out to you, anything that's interesting. If you want to see another video like this, or have any ideas, I'd be curious what you want to see. Huge shout out to all of our channel members for helping support the channel. Please like this video to help me out in the algorithm, and thanks for watching.